This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. Reviews of Billie Holiday, Josephine Baker, and The Green Hand, and other stories. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward, and we're two guys with advanced degrees who love talking about comics.
That's right. And on the November Eurocomics episode, Edward and I are going to discuss three titles. We're going to begin with Carlos Sampayo and Jose Muñoz's Billie Holiday. After that, we're going to look at another biography, one on Josephine Baker, written by Jose Luis Bocquet and art by Catel Muller. And then we're going to wrap up with Nicole Chevalu's The Green Hand and Other Stories. But before we get to those books, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for instance, right now, IDW just put out a biography of Calamity Jane, translated from French by none other than Diana Schutz, a former Dark Horse editor, and it's only $19.50 or $19.49, a 35% savings for a really quite a large deluxe hardcover book, very thoroughly historically researched, based on Calamity Jane's own letters to her daughter, and a lot of period detail. And there's also Uli Lust has a new book out from New York Review Comics, but you can get her first book, her English language debut, from Fantagraphics. Today is the last day of the rest of your life. It's a memoir of her punk days hitchhiking around Europe, and it's only $22.75. That's another 35% savings for a good 300 pages of just a lively young punk hijinks. These are some, and these are the kind of prices you're going to get on everything across the board, so it's a great place to stock up on some Euro comics.
That's right. Yeah, they have quite a number of texts and translations, so check out Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. So, Edward, before we get into a discussion of this month's books, we should say something about the fact that we haven't been on for the past several months. And in fact, I think the last time you and I did an episode was back in July.
July, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, we've gone, both of us, some life changes. I know that, as I've said on the podcast episodes in the past, I've moved to Charlotte, North Carolina to care for my father. So that was, been a disruptive. And yes, and I recently got a puppy, although so far my puppy, Bucky, has not kept me from podcasting. He's made it a challenge, but he hasn't kept me from it. But you have gone through one hell of a major life change since late summer, right?
Yeah, that's right. In late September, my wife and I had our first child, a daughter. Her name is Anouk Govin Chow, and she's really beautiful, like shockingly beautiful. It's because my wife and I are thoroughly average looking, she's been the sun at the center of our universe, gravitationally rearranging everything.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's I guess one of the main reasons why we haven't been on with the Eurocomic series, because you have had your hands full. I've been there; it's been a number of years, but I definitely know what you're going through. Probably even more of a challenge because, I think my wife and I had a pretty good kind of rhythm in terms of our work and what we were able to do, and I think we got off a little luckier than a lot of first-time parents. But yeah. Major life changes. Congratulations on a Nook. And I hope that our Comics Alternative Eurocomics listeners will all, whether they send us an email or not, as they're listening to this, will raise a glass to you and your wife for your firstborn.
Well, thank you. I that would be wonderful. And actually, I have to say this doing this podcast has given me a lot of books that I can't wait to share with her or read to her when she gets, of age, and just introduce her to the wide, wonderful world of comics. And speaking of which, I almost forgot, is when you and I first met at the conference in Florida, we met a comics artist named Claire Stevens, and she and I collaborated on a short comic that got published in September also, for International Translation Day, which is the day of Saint Jerome, who was the patron saint of translation and a translator of the Bible, I think, right? And so that's online if anyone wants to go look at it.
Is Claire the one who did the illustrations of us as we were doing our keynotes?
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I sent her a little script that she liked, and we worked on it a bit. We tossed it back and forth a bit during the summer, adding little things. It's amazing because you write a script thinking that, you see it in your head, and then when someone actually puts it down on paper, you're like, you think of all the things you didn't bother seeing. It was a lot of fun. Amazon Crossing, which is Amazon's translation imprint, sponsored it for International Translation Day. So yeah, it's over at Words Without Borders. It's just Google my name and Words Without Borders, or it's called Going Native. The title of the strip is called Going Native. So that and Words Without Borders, and you'll find it. But yeah, it was really cool, and we're working on another one, so we hope to keep that going.
Wow! Well, congratulations on both of your new creations, right? This collaboration with Claire, and of course, a Nook. Or since we're kind of book guys, I should say, instead of maybe a new addition to your family.
Because my name is Edward.
And there's that as well. Okay, so enough being corny. Let's go ahead and get to today's discussion. And we're going to begin, I guess, the first two books, the biographies of Billie Holiday and then Josephine Baker, are actually two that we had intended to discuss for the August show, because these books both came out in either mid or late May of this year. But, again, life got in the way, and so we decided to discuss them now, along with a brand new book that will be coming out in late November, The Green Hand and Other Stories. We'll get to that later in the show. But, we should mention that with Billie Holiday and the Josephine Baker biographies, and then with other books we're going to be discussing in the next couple of months, some of these books have been out for a little while, so over the next 2 or 3 months, Edward and I, to some degree, are going to be playing catch-up. But that's okay, because we've discussed books on the Eurocomic series before that have been out for a while, like this Billie Holiday book that we're going to begin with. Now, this one...
Yeah, so, the theme of this episode was originally, when it was just these two bios of lady jazz singers, that was, the theme was obvious. But, even though we've thrown on the Clavelou collection, I think it's still a strong showing for women.
Yes,
this
definitely.
time, because the Billie Holiday is about a woman, but it's, male creators. But the Josephine Baker is Catel Muller is the artist is a woman. So and then you get full on into woman territory with Nicole Clavelou, because not only is she a woman writing about women, often very graphically, and sometimes collaborating with yet another woman writing for her. So
Edith Za.
Yeah, Edith Za.
Yeah, and we will talk about that. I'm looking forward to your take on The Green Hand and Other Stories. Now, this Billie Holiday book, written by Carlos Sampayo with art by Jose Muñoz, this originally, I guess, was published in French in 1991.
Muñoz and Sampaio have worked extensively in France, and it's really through them that through France rather, that they came to the attention of and began to influence Americans, like Frank Miller's talked about them. I mean, it's not really this book; it's more a book that we plan to cover in the future.
Right, the Alex Sinner series.
Yeah, but which is a noir private eye series. But this is our the debut on this show of Muñoz and Sampaio, who are a very recognizable team and force on the international comic stage.
Yeah. And you mentioned the noir feel of the Alex Sinner series. I do think that this Billie Holiday book has a somewhat noir feel to it as well. And in fact, on the cover of this edition, and there's a reason why I'm saying of this edition, you have an image of Billie Holiday sitting at the table with a cigarette, and of course in the background there seems to be cigarette smoke in the cafe or the bar that she, probably is going to be singing at or has sang at, which again kind of gives that noir feel to it. Now, I mentioned this edition. This edition was published by NBM back in late May of this year. But this is actually not the first time this book has been released. In 1993, Fantagraphics came out with this translation. I'm assuming it's the same translators as we have here, Katie McCrae, Robert Boyd, and Kim Thompson. So because of Kim Thompson, I'm assuming that it's, the exact same translation that Fantagraphics put out in 1993. But NBM has come out with this new edition. I haven't seen the Fantagraphics edition. I'm assuming, though, that there's something new in the NBM edition that we're discussing, because according to Amazon, the Fantagraphics edition that came out in 93 was only 56 pages, which is shorter than this. And so I'm wondering if the introduction of this volume that we're discussing by Francis, Marmande?
Yeah. Well, actually,
if that was in the original.
No, I doubt it. Well, here's the thing. Well, if you look at the actual story pages versus the kind of sketchbook folio at the end and the introduction, it's 62 minus 12, so it only comes out to 50 pages of actual stories. So, and also there's a noticeable difference in the quality of translation between the introduction and the actual book. I know it's sometimes hard to compare someone translating relatively simple snippets of dialogue versus someone having to translate a sustained essay, but right from the start, there's the first sentence is a real train wreck that you can just see the French through it, and you wish they would have just chopped it up a little into smaller sentences the way English works, and it wouldn't make a difference. Are you
talking about the intro or the comic itself?
Yeah, I'm talking about the intro. Yeah.
Okay. The intro, which is about 11 pages, 10 or 11 pages. It kind of introduces and puts into context the life of Billie Holiday as you would expect. It doesn't cover the entirety, but it does talk about what she did and her significance. And to me, it's somewhat like the comics text that Sampaio and Muñoz present, in that we get little spot moments in Holiday's life, but at a distance. And the distance here is the way that Sampaio has chosen to tell his story in the way that Muñoz has illustrated it, and that is through the lens or the pen, so to speak, of a journalist. Because there are basically two times in this biography. There's the time of Billie Holiday's life that we see in the various panels, and then there's the more contemporary time, 30 years after Billie Holiday has died. that a journalist is having to put together the pieces of her life, actually learn who she is and what she did and why she was so important in order to write a story for his newspaper. So this journalist gets a call from his editor, like at the last minute, I think the night before the edition needs to come out, and tells him he needs to write this retrospective of Billie Holiday, and the journalist doesn't really know who Billie Holiday is. So he calls his assistant and says, hey, you have to help me here. I need to get as much information on Billie Holiday as possible. The editor wants me to write this piece on the 30-year anniversary of her death. And so the story that we get, in essence, is what the journalist has been pulling together late at night, overnight, doesn't get any sleep, in order to turn the story in that next morning. And so that's the life of Billie Holiday that Sampayo and Muñoz presents to us. And out of necessity, it's spotty where we have just certain moments in her life. So we do not get, unlike, let's say, the Josephine Baker book that we'll discuss next, a longer, more sustained biography. We get something that is kind of, quite stripped down, but entertaining nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this team is known for their manipulation and skillful use of black and white, but for me, it really. The moodiness, I think, that comes off these pages, if you compare their use of black and white to, say, Chaboutet's in Moby Dick, I feel like Muñoz and Sampayo have a much, or rather Muñoz in this case, Muñoz has a much more fluid use of it, and I feel like Chaboutet's can get a little repetitive or programmatic in a way, at least as shown in on display in Moby Dick. Whereas this, I feel like, can really pivot on a dime in terms of mood and tone. It can go from really sort of almost woodcutty and to kind of garish and Ouija-esque. In terms of it's just really harsh lighting, and the faces can get often quite exaggerated yet recognizable in a little bit of a grotesque kind of way, and I mean I'm sure I'll get into this later with Josephine Baker too. But I think one of the things that has come up in discussions of presenting people of color in comics is how to do so without, especially I think it came up even in the specific context of Asians, right? Like how to draw someone so it's obvious they're Asian without resorting to any like very stereotypical and therefore insulting looks and I think there's one thing that's really skillful in here is the way black faces are handled, because I think that was actually an issue in Josephine Baker where some of the art had to be redone.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So at the request of the American publisher, which is so it's a whole other issue. But like I said, we'll get into that. But like I do think the faces in here they're not only good on that score, they're also good. They're just very expressive, and there's quite a range of them. And there's some very alarming framings as well. I think the ones that one that sticks out to mind is the panel where she actually dies, where it announces her death. It's late in the book. Is like the giant. It's like a giant. It's a view of her hand reaching into, like reaching toward the reader, right? And all we see is this black giant shape, right? And her face in the background between her fingers.
Yeah, everything you've said about the art, I think, rings true, and I think it's a great description of Muñoz's representation in the use of black and white. You mentioned how this creative team is noted, among other things, not only for their use of black and white, but influencing certain creators like Frank Miller. And I'm looking right now on page 51 of the NBM edition, and this is the page where I guess we're introduced to a song that became a signature piece for her, and that is Strange Fruit. And so she's singing Strange Fruit, and it's basically a page 51 of 4 panels. The panel at the very bottom, the long one, we have a close-up of her lips as she's singing "The Body of a Hanged Man, an Uppity Negro Like Me." And there's something about this close-up, I mean, big time close-up of her lips as she's singing, just strikes me as something that could be straight out of Sin City.
Yeah, or even look at the upper right-hand corner on that page that you're pointing out, and the framing where you're looking really more at the giant shadow she casts on the stage curtains instead of her head. Her head is pretty much cut off. I mean, it's a very daring framing, and to, it's this kind of, and it keeps the panels. It keeps the story very, very dynamic because they're very sort of deliberately jarring transitions, sort of sustained by mood.
Mm-hmm. Right. You mentioned that every now and again the art, when it comes to facial representation, can almost take the form of grotesques. And that's one of the things I found, especially with the not so much with Billie Holiday and those musicians who worked with her, but the other individuals who were a part of either the music, the bar, the entertainment scene, especially white characters. So, for instance, I just referenced that image on page 51. Well, on the facing page 50, there is, I can't remember who this guy is, but he's in the middle of page 50 and he says, "That's it, asshole, you're fired."
Yeah.
And the way his face is drawn, he looks like a gremlin almost.
Yeah.
And there are one or two other instances of individuals like that who are shown in I don't want to call it a less than flattering or ugly way, but I think grotesque is probably a better way that you've put that. And so this variety of style, or at least variety within certain limitations, I think does add to, as you were calling it, the fluidity of the art, which feeds into the fluidity of the storytelling, the way that I contextualized it earlier. You have a journalist who's putting together the bits and pieces of Billie Holiday's life, never going into too much detail, but giving us just enough to get the bare outline of who Billie Holiday was. And there is something kind of fluid to that form of storytelling as well. So I think the art and the writing go hand in hand here.
And one thing, they don't do it very often. I think only 2 or 3 times in the course of the book. But I do like when they do a speech balloon that isn't a speech balloon, that's a picture. It's kind of a close-up of usually generally it's a close-up of another body part. There's one on 16 and another one on 44 that there's the one on 16 is Louis Armstrong singing, and then coming out of his mouth is someone else's mouth.
I see that. Yeah.
And then on 44 there's someone the close-up of someone's eye, and it's what's coming out of the eye. What the eye is expressing is another eye, and how it would with a different look to it. I did enjoy that. I thought those were nifty. But if you look at 42, the top panel and the view of the city there, that's something out of Lionel Fenninger, or even the woodcut people.
Yes,
right?
that's the woodcut part that you mentioned.
Yeah, but then if you look at page 18, and the cat skidding across the street, that's very Miller-esque. That middle panel on 18.
Right, showing that movement, that kinesis there in the cat as it scampers across.
Yeah. Or the cop car on 53. I also think is this sudden, with the cop car suddenly gets reduced to very almost a sketch, barely there. It's just a white shape with a couple lines, but it's more the negative space around it that defines it.
Right.
And it's streaming headlights.
Yeah, and the headlights and the light emanating from the siren give it this sense, and the way that it's drawn, it gives it a sense of movement. Yeah, I enjoyed this book. Again, this is the first time that I have read it. I did not read the Fantagraphics edition that came out in 1993. Were you aware of the earlier edition?
No, and actually, I didn't know either. I guess I just haven't been keeping up. I didn't realize that NBM had a whole line, like a little imprint of all biographies. I didn't know they'd done so many, and that so many were translated as well. I mean, like even their Elvis bio is by French people.
Yeah. I notice every month going through the previews catalog that often in the NBM section there are biographies. I think I saw one recently on Jean-Paul Sartre, which I think that was NBM, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, maybe it's right here on the back page of Billie Holiday. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Now, that's something I would really love to take a look at because I don't know if I call myself a fan of Jean-Paul Sartre, but when I was a younger scholar in graduate school, I was fascinated by Sartre, and not just the existential side of him, but also the political part of him and the problematics of his politics, especially in his relationship with other people. At least for me, the most prominent relationship being the one with Albert Camus and the break between the two of them. So there's something about Sartre that has just fascinated me. Whether I like what he has to say or write or not, it doesn't matter. So I'd be interested in looking at that biography.
Yeah.
If not for this show, then later on down the road, just for my own pleasure.
I guess, I just surprised me because, because SelfMadeHero has their line of, they're generally only artists' biographies, right. but then to have two major indie publishers doing just exclusively bio lines, that's really interesting. That seems to be like a new feature of the landscape. I didn't think that was something that had that much traction here yet, and so, that's neat.
Well, what you just mentioned, I think, serves as a good segue into the second book that we're going to be looking at this month, and that is the one by SelfMadeHero, the biography, the rather hefty biography of Josephine Baker. This is written by José Luis Bocquet, and the art is by Catel Muller. And one of the things I found this also came out in May of this year. One of the things I find interesting is this creative team who did a previous SelfMadeHero book that came out in 2012, the biography of Kiki de Montparnasse. Montparnasse. Okay, thank you, Mr. French speaker, for correcting me. Kiki de Montparnasse. I didn't read that. I have it, but I haven't been able to read it yet, and I've had it for a few years. But I want to read it after having read this Josephine Baker biography because I'm fascinated by this. Now,
the Baker book is actually the Baker book is actually the third collaboration. Just that the middle one, the Kiki de Montparnasse was their first. The middle one wasn't translated into English because it was a figure of a neglected figure of the French Revolution. So that hasn't made it. But
I wanted to ask you something about this because on the cover, the creative team is listed as Catel and Bocquet. Now, Bocquet is the last name, but Catel is a first name, right? So this artist, Catel Muller, goes by her first name.
Yep.
I guess. Okay. Now, I really like this book, but I tell you, one thing that really bugged me about it was this lousy translation. Okay.
Well,
we should say that the translator for most of this book is our dear co-host, Edward.
Thank you. No, yeah, I translated everything but the very extensive 100 pages of dense prose at the end. All the back matter was translated by a colleague of mine, Mercedes Gilliam, because that just hit me at a time when I was moving house to Oregon, where I am now, to Eugene. So it couldn't happen, but I was glad to be able to give a friend some work. And,
I wondered.
It's basically
about that.
A novel. I mean, it's like I remember doing the word count on it and be like, "Whoa, no, it's like 50,000 words or something." It's like, it's
what the translation that Mercedes did at the back.
Yeah, just the back matter because it's so thorough, right? It's so you have like a 400 or 500 page, 450 page graphic novel, and then you have like another 100 pages of of text, right? With biographies of all the historical people who have cameos and walk-ons in it. And
major and minor characters. And then you have that
timeline,
that extensive timeline of her life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean, I don't. This isn't the longest book. This isn't the longest single book I've done for Self-Made, but it's definitely the one of the biggest back matter. And but yeah, no. Actually, just one last thing on the Billie Holiday is because Louis Armstrong pops up in it. Is that there's one thing I always loved that Billie Holiday said about Louis Armstrong. She was defending him from people who in a later generation who called him an Uncle Tom, and she said, "Oh well, sure he Toms, but he pops Toms from the heart." And I've always found that very moving. A very moving thing to be able to say and to be able to see about someone else, because I know the current climate is very, very fraught in terms of race relations and it has been for a while. But the thing is, it's always kind of a moving target, right? Like people are always in the best of worlds, people are always trying to change and learn and adapt to new paradigms and new understandings of old inequalities. So like it's nice when someone can, for me at least, it's nice when someone can sort of bridge that a little out of compassion or insight. Or
and I mean, from what I understand, it wasn't until later in his career that Louis Armstrong was labeled that way by at least some, to be kind of an Uncle Tomish type character. Because early in his career, that wasn't so much an issue. But once he became, let's say, the jazz ambassador, right, for the United States, and he would travel abroad, and he became this figure. I mean, this is a guy who ended up doing a lot of things that had quite broad and popular appeal, like Hello, Dolly and What a Wonderful World. I mean, those pieces, as nice as they are, I mean, it's not really classic Louis Armstrong. Right. But him getting labeled as something of an Uncle Tom character came from around that period later in his career, let's say the 1950s into the 1960s. Again, from my understanding of this. Now, I am not an expert or a historian of jazz, but I do know a little bit. And
well, that's a good segue back, because I think one of the things that I translated also an interview for CBR, for Comic Book Resources, with Catel and Bocquet. And one of the things they definitely wanted to do, highlight in this particular biography, is they said that many people knew about Josephine Baker, international star of the stage and song, but they didn't. Fewer people. Somehow, history had sort of come to neglect or overlook her role in the civil rights movement, right. And that was something they wanted to bring to the fore. And one of the things this book does, when they were challenged by the interviewer on why they had so much back matter, we were just talking about the back matter. They said that what they really intended the back matter as is basically like if they'd been able to build a website just for the book, that was where all this stuff would have gone. It would have been hyperlinked throughout the book, so you could because I think one of the eye-opening things about working on this is, sure, you have this kind of vague idea. Someone's an international star. You have a vague idea of what that means, but I didn't realize just how many lives of major figures she had crossed paths with and touched. I mean, I didn't know she had an affair with Le Corbusier and Georges Simenon. That's like having an affair with a major architect and a major writer. And then that she got along with Castro and De Gaulle and Sammy Davis Jr. It's kind of amazing. And one of the things that you get to do, they said they wish they could have had 2,000 pages to tell her story. And I see that only in that one of the, I think, strengths of this book is the way they handle the sweep of time. I mean, as I was working on it, I was like, this is a really basic structure. It's just a chronicle. They're just going like year by year by year, but mm-hmm. but on the other hand, you realize that cumulatively when I finished it and looked back on it, I was like, editing it and everything, I was like, this book has a lot of eras in it. It through the lens of her life, it covers a lot of social change.
Right. Yeah. Now, this book originally was published in French by Casterman in 2016, correct?
I believe so. Yeah. When I first got the pages for it, they weren't even done. They were like there were parts that the art was not finished. I had to incorporate changes to the dialogue later. Like I got it in a very SelfMadeHero picked it up, I think, at a book fair or directly from Casterman in a not yet finished form.
Oh, okay. But one of the things you were mentioning about the sheer length, breadth of this biography, you say it chronicles her life, and it really does. And this is one way in which the Josephine Baker book definitely contrasts with or from the Billie Holiday text that we were just discussing, in that if the Billie Holiday book was, let's say, moments of Holiday's life here and there, where you never go into too much detail, but you get a broad outline of what was going on and who was Billie Holiday. And you had a different kind of narrative structure, right? Things are primarily focalized, for the most part, I guess, through this journalist, right? So as he's getting the information and writing his story, those are the moments of Billie Holiday's life that we see played out in the panels. Josephine Baker, though, is very different in that it's more in depth. It covers the her entire life, from the opening chapter is when her mother and father meet at a dance. And then
it starts before her, right?
Yes, exactly. So it not only covers her entire life, but it starts even before her.
And it's completely chronological. There's no framing device.
Exactly.
It's straight up.
It is a straight out biography. And I mean, I have no problem with either formats, both the Billie Holiday and the Josephine Baker. They're just two very different books. They're different ways of telling the story of someone's life.
I mean, for me, the trade-off is that the Baker is obviously much more of a source and teachable, but it trades off a certain. It's less of an art object. Right?
Yeah,
I mean, because the style is much more straightforward, both in art and in narration, and in panel layout. There's nothing tricky going on. There's no like attempt at some virtuoso original breakdowns on the page or anything. It's very straightforward, and the art is it's like the Orwell line about good prose is a window pane, right? The art is clearly trying to be more of a window pane, whereas if Muñoz's art is a window pane, it's a very very smoky,
looking through the glass darkly.
Yeah, it's a different. It's not a clear window. So it's straightforward, and you sacrifice a certain amount of, I don't know, artiness, but you get a lot of information.
Right. Now, I want to talk about the art for a moment, since you brought it up. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the Josephine Baker biography and Catel Muller's art is the way that she draws, especially a younger Josephine Baker, because one of the things that I came away with, especially in the first half, but even all the way through to the end with Josephine Baker, is how much of an entertainer and how much of a clown she can be, especially when she was younger. I mean, she's someone who loved attention, who loved to have a good time, who would like to jump around and dance, both literally and figuratively. She also loved a good joke and making people laugh. And so the way that Catel draws her early on especially, but even toward the end, she links the face with the way that Josephine Baker smiles and grins and sometimes even crosses her eyes. And so there is an impishness to Josephine Baker. And, I knew who Josephine Baker was. I didn't know the details of her life. And that was one of the discoveries in reading this biography that I came away with, that she was someone who was a joker, who liked to have a good time and liked to entertain people. Now, I mentioned this because I want to get to a question. I want to ask you something that you referred to earlier, and you said that some of the illustration for the American edition, for the U.S. edition, the way that black faces or some black faces were represented had to be changed. And so my question to you is, was the way that Catel drew Josephine Baker changed from the French to the English translation?
Yeah, but they were spot changes, and I'll explain that in a minute. I do have to agree with you, though. I do think it's a triumph. What you see especially in the dancing and segments, for Catel, it's a triumph of cartooning, right? Like in his little book on cartooning, Ivan Brunetti goes on, talks about succinctness of what you're trying to get in a cartoon is, and as few strokes as possible to convey this. There's this sense of essentialness, right? And that's what distinguishes it from some realistic figure drawing or something. And I do think it is a triumph of cartooning. She's able to capture a lot of motion and emotion, and they talk about it in the interview. They talk about how apparently there's not that much footage, actual film footage of her dancing. She's in a couple movies and there's a lot of photos, but there's not but Catel would just keep watching a couple of silent sequences of her on stage, and then just draw her dancing again and again on sheet after sheet after sheet until it just became really natural to her, and she knew she could do it in a couple lines, and then she knew that was it. Like she'd gotten down, she'd pared it down to the essence, right? Like she knew which lines were going to express the motion the most, and so it's almost like practicing a signature in order to forge it, until it becomes natural, right? So that, I thought that was an interesting insight into the process of because you're right, she captures a lot of liveliness in those sequences. This has happened before with other books that we've done, that I've done for SelfMadeHero, is that when it gets to the Abrams stage, I think the discourses on what's racist and what's not in terms of imagery, and also content, narrative content, vary a lot. These standards vary a lot from country to country. And you're getting three countries involved here. You're getting France, the UK, and America. And America has just really different sensitivities when it comes to these things. And so, so we had to wrangle with the Abrams editors a lot. Like the Abrams editors even first came out and were I replaced a lot of N-words with darky or something. I couldn't use pickaninny. I couldn't use And the thing is this, for me, this was there's some back and forth on this, because this is a true story of someone who went through this went through certain kinds of specific abuse at specific historical periods. So you don't want to take that out. At least in my view, you don't want to take that out. It's not like we're doing The Hateful Eight or something, or some Tarantino reconstruction of a past that never existed, and people are just throwing the N-word left and right. So there was some contention, and to answer your question specifically, there were a couple panels where they felt like she looked too monkeyish.
Yes, and that's what I was wondering.
It's difficult because she was specifically asked to look monkeyish in her show. Like they put a freaking grass skirt on her, a banana leaf skirt on her, right? Like she was asked. She was sold as a savage, and she was asked even the French word for it to ape. She was told to ape. Things, but there were a couple times when you could fix that just with the little spot touches, like darkening the nose a little more or darkening it a little less, or there were little things that could just reduce it, and those were done at a later stage, because at Abrams' request, and then framing the sort of narrative argument that got brought up again and again was basically this I don't know if you felt this way, but even when I was reading it for the first time, to me this feels like a very Euro book. It has a Euro slant on race relations in that most of the time it talks about how great Europe was compared to the US for Josephine Baker. And that's true in many ways. Like she can go into restaurants through the front door in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. She can be paid more. She can become a star. She can buy houses. She can moving the society, like all those things are true. Like she's on many social levels, she's a lot freer. But and I think it's illegitimate to present it that way in this book because you're kind of seeing it through her eyes, and she would have probably felt those things. But at the same time, what the book, I feel, glosses over a bit, and what the Americans wanted punched up, was the fact that the price of this was being sold as a Congo attraction, basically, a Hottentot. And another word I was not allowed to use. I'm like, come on, but I think we had to find a balance where that's a very contemporary. Just to be able to make that distinction, that sexual politics distinction is a retrospective view, I think, and it's true the book doesn't foreground it as much as it does her sort of relative economic and social freedom in Europe at the expense of the United States. And I think the American ego is just a bit stung when they read this, and they're like, no, we got to show how the Europeans were really racist too, which they totally were, because she built her career on wearing a banana leaf skirt and jumping around like a monkey.
Right, but it's a different kind of racism.
It's a different kind of racism.
Yeah. Another thing that what you're saying reminds me of something else that was going on at the same time, even though Josephine Baker really wasn't a part of it, and that is the Harlem Renaissance, because during the early part of the 20th century, right, the 2 decades leading up to the Second World War, on the one hand, there was this flowering, Renaissance of art coming from the African American community. But at the same time, one of the things that I think drew a lot of enthusiasts in art, in literature, in dance and whatnot to what became known as the Harlem Renaissance is this kind of exoticness, right? Something that is different. In other words, the same kind of things that many of Josephine Baker's fans in Europe were drawn to, right? That there is something African and different and dark about this. And I think that that's what drew a lot of people to some of the art coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, for better or for worse. Now, granted,
Josephine of primitivism.
Exactly. Now, granted, Josephine Baker really wasn't a part of what was going on in the Harlem Renaissance, primarily because she's over in Europe, right? In the years before the Second World War. But nonetheless, there's something similar going on here. And it's interesting to hear you talk about some of these behind-the-scene things that were going on as you were translating, because, I find this fascinating. I couldn't help but think of, and again, this is kind of a common dilemma. What do you do with something like Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, both in terms of coming out with new editions and also, especially in my case, teaching that book, where you have multiple instances of not only the N-word, but of scene scenarios and even language that many people find today extremely offensive. And to me, that's always been one of the biggest hurdles of teaching Mark Twain and specifically Huckleberry Finn. But as you were saying, this is the historical reality that Josephine Baker was encountering, and to whitewash that, so to speak, is doing a disservice to her story.
Well, especially since it's also very much thematically part of this story. Her struggle with racism is it's there. There's the horrific, very early on, there's a horrific scene with the burning down of the black neighborhood in St. Louis, it carries through. It informs almost every aspect of her life. Her embrace of Frenchness, and that vision of cosmopolitanism, to her, her legacy of her adopted family, express her rainbow family, expressly adopting children from different ethnicities and different national backgrounds. It's something that she was very consciously addressing with her life. So to minimize the suffering seems to take a leg out from under that chair. But I do think it's not something. These are triggers, and they're not to be thrown around gratuitously. And we're always asking for our readers for input, but actually readers are something I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear readers' reactions to this particular story, because I think sometimes what the bad feeling you get when you're caught up in one of these editorial wrangles is that you're not dealing with how a reader, or even a reader of color, might actually respond to it. What you're dealing with is a marketing department,
right?
Afraid of a marketing department like real erring on the side of what they think is caution, and it's not the same. It's not coming from the same place,
right?
So, yeah.
I'm with you. I'd like to hear from our listeners, especially those who, well, particularly those who have read this book, or if nothing else, have looked through parts of it, and let us know what their reaction to some of these things are. I want to mention something there. You mentioned the scene with the Eads Bridge burning. To me, okay, let me back up a bit. I came away from this biography with much more of a sense of her time in Europe and much less of a sense of her early life, including the way that racism affected her, that we see primarily in the first part of this biography. If anything, I think that the creators kind of played down the Americanness of the racism. There is that Eads Bridge scene where we do see the racism. Outside of that, though, it seems to me, and again, it's been a while since I read this, but from what I recall, the only other times there are references, more overt references to racism in the United States are those many moments throughout, especially the last two-thirds of the book, where Josephine Baker says something about, in America I couldn't do this, but I can here in Europe. In America I had to enter through the kitchen or the back door. Now I can come into the front here now that I live in Europe. Old things were so bad back in the United States. Here I can do much more, have much more freedom. And that may be true, but that is kind of a second-hand window into American racism. I didn't get that much, again, outside of the bridge burning incident, I really didn't get much of a sense of how racism may have affected her and even scarred her in certain ways, her and her family, from, let's say, the first quarter of this book, or the first third, where we do have her growing up, living in St. Louis.
Well, okay, so for instance... Oh, no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, did you feel the same way, or am I just forgetting what I read?
Honestly, I feel like it's a property of the... I feel to some extent it's a property of the chronicle structure to sort of like that the early things kind of fade. Because I remember when I was working through it, and like I would get to these points where I feel like, this is a story already. Like this was a novel, or her early relationship with her father. Like I feel like, this was a whole story already. It feels like we're coming to an end of something, and then I'm like, I'm only a fifth of the way through the book. So I do think certain things fade out, but I also like here, for instance, on page 100, right? It ends a chapter. There's a panel that was a focus of some contention when they thought it was too flippant for the people on the. There's a train speeding away, and then in the to one side there's a black man lynched on a tree, and they felt it was too flippant for the people on the train to be saying, this to be talking about music, to be saying that sometimes I think music is all. I actually had to punch it up because I think the original French was something like, "Hey, we're going to New Orleans and." It says, to us black musicians, New Orleans is our capital, Josephine. And then the other balloon of dialogue had something like, thank God we have music, or we'll always have music. And I had to punch it up to, this world is a living hell for black folks. Sometimes I think music is all we've got, because they really wanted something. Abrams really wanted something to counterbalance the fact that there was just a black man hanging off a tree there. And they felt it was too, like that. They felt that could not stand on its own. And horrify the reader, and it had to be somehow addressed. It had to be somehow pointed out. We had to make sure we told people, "Hey, look, this is bad." And so there were things like that where we had to punch up or rewrite the dialogue in the book to satisfy them. There's another part where
hold on. Let's. Yeah. I want to, before you leave page 100 and go to another example. Let me ask you, from what you remember, did you resist what the editors were saying, that they had to explain or tell more than rely on showing?
Selfmade's they've got a really good proofreader that they work with, and he kind of put up a fight, and I guess I felt like I staked out the middle ground by like when I had control over how I punched it up, right? I was the one suggesting rewordings. So like I felt like, okay, I can punch it up to here and it still feels like within the bounds of translation, but I'm not gonna, like, so then I felt like I was actually the one who kind of brokered that transaction in a way.
Because the way you described what the original was strikes me as being more reliant on irony. And again, having the visuals and also the dialogue work in ways that maybe show the irony more than tell you, hey, isn't this ironic? But the fact that you had to punch it up, it does more telling than showing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there was parts where like there's another dialogue later on where it's I think it's when they're in New York. She's in New York with her lover / agent, and she's complaining about how like she had to go into the back door of a hotel or stuff like that, and like they made in that case it wasn't even me punching up the authors. They asked the authors to rewrite that dialogue, and I translated their new version because and it was another one of those things where. I think they just didn't like it because it made Europe sound great and America sound like it sucked, and they wanted it to show that Europe also sucked a little.
Well, yeah, I mean, many parts of the world suck for black individuals, but I think that there is probably an elevated level of suckiness for African Americans than there are Africans or those of African descent in other parts of the world, specifically Europe. That would be my guess, but maybe I'm romanticizing Europe more than need be.
No, I mean, I think it's more just that the fallouts of colonialism and chattel slavery are so very, very different that it's very hard. I mean, that's kind of what people were going on and on about with the Charlie Hebdo covers too. It's like there are a lot of things that are objectively racist, but we're going to feel they're even more racist than they are felt to be racist over there, but they're actually, but working change on either side is hard.
Even given the fact that you, as a translator, and then the editors at SelfMadeHero and Abrams had to feel that they had to, in certain parts of the narrative, doctor things up a bit. I mean, I do think that this is a very enjoyable, entertaining, and educational. You used the word educational earlier, and I think that's quite appropriate. Work here, and I really enjoyed it.
No, like I said, it does a good job bringing to life the various eras she passes through, and it gives you a sense of the sort of sweeping social change that was the backdrop to her.
Right, and not only the eras that she lived through, but the different Josephine Bakers that we see, because the Josephine Baker as represented toward the end of this biography is very different from a younger, earlier Josephine Baker who was, obviously younger, more energetic, much more ambitious, and willing to do what she needed to do in order to make it. The older Josephine Baker, as you would expect, is a little more wise, a little more empathic, and also is much more willing to take on social causes, not just for her, but primarily for others. And, both the specific kids, that you had mentioned that she adopts, and also for cases in the abstract, right, working for the civil rights movement. So I do appreciate that. So you do get a sweep of 20th century European or Western history, I guess, in this story, but you also get to see the evolution of a woman, even before she was born all the way up to her death, and the different manifestations that her personality took on, and the people that she was involved with. It's fascinating, and that's something that you can only get from a longer narrative like this. Very different from Muñoz and Sampayo's Billie Holiday.
Yeah, like her spy days in World War II, that's crazy. I mean, when she almost lost her life over in Algeria, it's like, that's like you could carve that out and put make your own story out of that, just that part.
Yeah. So, Edward, anything else about the Josephine Baker biography, or do you want to move on to the last book that we're discussing this month?
Yeah, no, I think moving on is good.
Okay, a very different kind of book, not a biography, works of fiction that are, I guess, on the more surreal, experimental side. This is The Green Hand and Other Stories, written with, for the most part, with art by Nicole Chevalou. Although, as we mentioned earlier, Edith Za is the one who collaborated with Chevalou on the title story, the longest one in this series, The Green Hand. And so this is The Green Hand and Other Stories. Now, The Green Hand itself is in, 5 parts?
Yeah, it's a really even split, basically. Like, The Green Hand is in color, and the rest of the book isn't. So all the Edith Za stuff is the color stuff that comes up front.
Well, there's some others that are color. Like, for instance, I think No Family is in color, isn't it? The story No Family.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I think so, because that's.
Oh no, you're right. You're totally right. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right.
And I think it's after that.
Yeah.
So The Green Hand, this longer story, is in 5 parts: The Green Hand, The Black Grass, The White Knight, Blue Funk, and Purple Sideshows. And so obviously we have a color theme going on there. So it's appropriate that story's in color. And then we get the stories that follow, the other stories in the title: No Family. And then The Little Vegetable Who Dreamed He Was a Panther, The Ninny and Her Prince Charming, Stupa Story number 1, A Little Girl Always in a Dream, The Tale of Blondie, Dearest Doe, and Fat Kitty Cat, and then Underground Chatter. And then this volume ends with an interview with both Nicole Chevalou and Edith Za that was conducted and translated by Madeleine Schwartz.
Yep.
Also, and that's not all, Daniel Klaus does the introduction to this.
Yeah, and he talks about how he, read her back in the day, but without, just was a fan of hers just from the art, and had no idea what the words said, but just liked looking at her color work.
Yeah. Now, these stories that are contained in this volume originally were published between 1978 and 1980. I think The Green Hand was published in 78, and the others primarily coming out from the original Heavy Metal, I guess 1979 and 1980. This is being published late this month. I think the pub date according to Amazon.com, is November 28th from New York Review Comics, someone that we have discussed a few times on this show, and who is, the publicists, the marketing people are very kind in that they send us copies of whatever books they come out with. And so that's one of the reasons why we discuss a number of New York Review Comics. And this was translated by Donald Nicholson Smith. So not some guy named Gavin.
No, but Nicholson Smith, a very very good, very established translator. We've done a lot of work on situationists and anarchists. Someone I respect.
Yeah. Now I wondered how Daniel Klaus's intro would sit with the rest of the volume. I thought it was a pretty good intro. It's relatively short, but basically it's more of a personal reflection than anything, and I appreciated that. As you described it, Klaus is primarily talking about or writing about his experiences encountering Chevalou's work earlier in life, but not really getting everything out of it that he should have, and then coming to the work, a number of years later, the necessity of this new volume that New York Review Comics is putting out. I mean, I thought it was an effective intro. Short, sweet, sets a stage.
Yeah, and he also, I'm really glad, because I would have done it all anyway, is he gives a shout out to the work of Dustin Harbin, who relettered this, and yes. I think the lettering is really quite excellent.
Dustin Harbin, by the way, a Charlotte native.
Ah.
Yes.
Wow.
Where I'm sitting right now. I mean, he's not from my house, but...
But I do disagree with Klaus only in that I actually like the black and white stuff better, oddly enough. So,
I can't remember. Did he mention something about the color?
Taste. Yeah, he said that was why he got into her.
Okay,
it was her bold use of color, transfixed by the beautiful electrified colors, unlike any I'd ever seen before or since.
I mean, I think that most, if not all, of the stories in this collection are on the surreal, even borderline psychedelic side. Maybe I came away thinking that The Green Hand was the most surreal / psychedelic because of the color.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think it also just has a less. It's much more amorphous and has definitely a lot less closure than the later ones. And I kind of like some of the snap of the later ones. I feel like they have some satirical or grotesque touches that I can more immediately identify. Whereas I think there are parts of The Green Hand that stick out to me, but because the narrative is so open-ended, not just as a whole, but even within its many chapters, I think I just run toward the later stuff.
Yeah, and the Green Hand, again, this story in 5 parts is, I don't know if I want to call it a story about this woman and the bird that apparently lives with her. But the woman exactly and the bird who lives with her are the main characters in this story in 5 parts. And depending on what part you're in, the protagonist is either one or the other, the woman or the bird. And they have a weird relationship. We don't really know what the hell it's all about. There are plants involved. And there's some other weird things that go on. I agree with you that what happens in The Green Hand as a whole is rather amorphous, ambiguous. There's a lack of closure. And to some degree, I guess I agree with you when you say there's that lack of snap or punch. I can't remember how you described it, as you have in some of the later stories. But yeah, it was fun. In many ways, The Green Hand kind of meandered, but meandered in a good way.
Oh, sure. Like, I do think even as amorphous as it is, there is a sense of build, because when you get to the splash page in the final section where the bird climbs over the wall and sees the titular fair, the purple fair, and I do feel something. I don't know what I feel, but I feel something because, and maybe I just feel that, hey, here's a splash page, and this is the biggest splash page we've seen yet. but even that has some, difficult to articulate effect on it. A sense of culmination somehow, so like, and I do think panel to panel, there's a lot of like it's weird. It's like the pages definitely cohere, but panel to panel, it's kind of like we were talking about with the Billie Holiday, the so-called the camera placement or the POV can change so drastically, but the color and the mood carry it over. But it does seem like there is a sense of a very, very thought out world behind these panels, because everything's been very lived in and seen completely, because you're seeing it from so many angles. The angles are changing. You're seeing it from surprising angles. Like even on the first page, like
you're talking about The Green Hand, right?
Yeah, even on the first page of Green Hand, when you're like looking through the old lady's hair, it's a very weird POV. And there's a lot of that where like the POV shifts abruptly. Like the camera, if it were a camera, the camera would have had to move very far, and yet it's a very it's both alarming and organic, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's definitely a freaky story, but it's fun, and it's quite different from some of, not all, but some of the shorter later pieces in the second half of the book. One that strikes me as very much joke-like, and I'm calling it joke-like because of, I think earlier you used the word punch. It does seem to have a punch line, and that is the Ninny and her Prince Charming. And this is a, 5-page, short story that seems to end with something that could be equivalent to a punchline.
Oh yeah, and I think No Family also ends with a pretty
that's a good point.
Those are kind of like Roald Dahlish kind of little nasty stories. And just one last note on the Green Hand, though, is that the bird felt very Dark Crystal-ish to me, like Jim Henson. But no, I mean, I do, those two, but like even Stupid Story has kind of like which probably some of the most basic art and panel layout we'll see in this whole book, and it's only 2 pages, but that has a kind of macabre punchline too. And I think sometimes what it reminds me of, even the art is very, very different, but it reminds me a little of Gahan Wilson.
Who?
Gahan Wilson. He's a single panel cartoonist. Pops up in New Yorker, Playboy, but not so much these days. About like 30 years ago. Yeah. But yeah, he does a lot of sort of grotesque, macabre stories.
Yeah. I think of the stories that follow the Green Hand, the one that I find the most curious is Underground Chatter, because it seems to be the strangest of the later stories in this collection.
Yeah, and the longest too, right? Or one of the longer...
Yeah, it's one of the longest. And so basically you have, I guess, on a subway, a woman with a baby that begins talking with another woman sitting beside them in an adult manner, and is quite insulting, not only to the woman who he's addressing, but also the woman who seems to be his mother, that he describes as, kind of stupid, little on the doltish side. And I don't know, it's just really weird.
It's like what happens in this story. A woman gets on the subway, gets hit on by a baby, then gets accosted by like a ticket checker,
right?
And then kind of adopted by a pet, right? Like she doesn't adopt the pet adopts her.
Yeah, this is some kind of weird primate,
right? So, and I mean, one of the things that I think is very effective also throughout is like her faces within the same panel. She can have several different styles of faces that seem like they don't belong in the same. They're not the same level of reality.
I agree.
And so they don't belong, and like it all adds to this. It contributes to this general sensation of nightmarishness. Really.
Yeah. I mean, it is, and I like the way that you described it as nightmarish. It's not really surreal in the same way that the Green Hand is, but there is something non-realistic and dreamlike about Underground Chatter, as well as with some of these other stories. Now, the one that I think immediately precedes this, that's the one, The Tale of Blondie, Dearest Dew, and the Fat Kitty. It strikes me as something like a fantastical fairy tale with these various characters. And even the way that it's drawn, I mean, this seems to be the most detailed art from Clavalou that we get in terms of the detail and the shading and the cross-hatching.
And the most, and the kitten is very, or the puss, or, she is very, is among the more realistic depictions of things. But I also have to say I mean, not only is just Dustin Harbin's lettering job. I mean, I'm not just talking about the dialogue, but also the way he's redone the titles, and often within the panels how he's had to redo signage. It's very good. It's very impressive. I feel like one of the differences. It's like these later stories seem to feel a little nastier and a little more, cackling and satirical. And I feel like one of the things about The Green Hand was, as strange as it got, it also just kind of had this dreamlike feel of nothing bad is going to happen. Like there was this sense of like continuous wandering and kind of a lugubriousness, but I never felt like dread. Whereas in certain parts in these later ones, it's actively scary or gross or wicked.
Yeah, well, I think that's nowhere better represented than in the one that we referred to a little earlier. The only other color comic, No Family, in addition to The Green Hand, which again is joke-like, but at the same time, it's horrific in that it deals with murder, to put it lightly.
Yeah, not to have a spoiler, but like the very last line, I wondered if it was a pun. I don't have the French to consult it, but like, because the last line, it says, apparently the cooking oil was adulterated, and by that they mean poisoned, which they already used the word poisoned in the line above. But like, and I was just, it stuck out to me because it's such a weird way to talk about something being poisoned. Well, like adulterated is just a word that it's such a strange way to refer to was it poisoned or not. And I wondered if that was some kind of pun on based on the story or some attempt of carrying over a pun based on the story because the story is about a baby murdering adults. Mm-hmm. So but I wasn't sure about that. I couldn't. It was just something that. In general, I don't feel like there's that kind of that kind of wordplay is very common in this text. So I wasn't sure. It wasn't borne out by other stuff.
Yeah. Now, as you were referring to this book earlier, you mentioned something about the way that Clavalou kind of sexualizes some of her characters, or at least writes them and illustrates them in certain sexual contexts. And to me, this is most apparent in the story A Little Girl Always in a Dream, because it begins with her as a little girl riding the arm of a chair.
Masturbating.
Masturbating in a way that's very Freudian, right, in terms of what it means to like riding a horse and what that symbolically represents for young women. And then we eventually move into, again, rather surreal, if not dream or nightmarish territory. And the story ends with references to her growing up and her menstruation. And, I mean, you see it literally, right? I mean, she's standing on a beach and naked and just bleeding. And it provides not only a river, but like an avalanche of blood. And so I think this is the most graphic it gets in this collection.
Yeah. There's actually this great, it's kind of a cult classic in France, but there's a great novel, and it's been translated to English by Richard Howard, the poet, but it's just out of print, but it's you can still get used copies. It's called Rosa, and it's so good. It's one of the best French fantastical novels, really, and it's set in like I don't know, like Napoleonic era, and it's about like these. It's basically about these soldiers who they keep disappearing from their barracks, and no one knows where they've gone, and they finally figure out that they've all disappeared wholly into the world inside this one prostitute. Huh. Like and like they go in, they go to bed with her, and then next thing you know they're like inside. Like, because there's a panel in here in the Clavalou where like we're looking up a river with a bridge and all this landscape, and the river goes straight into her crotch, and it just reminded me of that because it's like basically the captain who's trying to figure out where all his men have gone. He has to like tie himself to a rope and then venture inside the prostitute, and there's like a whole world in there, and it's really neat, but. It's kind of funny, and then they have to like yank him out with a big lever, and anyway.
Well, let me ask you: Did you know of the work of Nicole Clavalou before this?
Yeah, like I'd seen one. I'd seen just the beginning of the Green Hand in an old issue of heavy metal of the French of metal Metal Hurlant, the French version, but I that was it. Like I hadn't seen any of the black and white stuff. I hadn't really, and I had no idea how the rest of the Green Hand story went. In fact, I thought it would actually have more to do with plants and less to do with colors.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Actually, I ask you because this is my introduction to Clavalou's work, and I had not seen her before, and I didn't even know who she was until we got a copy of this book from New York Review Comics.
Yeah, but here's the thing: is that like this is something that I've been thinking about too, and is that so in the introduction, Klaus says something about how he's no expert on French comics, but he's got a couple favorite names from the same era. It says Yves Chalon, Serge Clair, and Chantal Montelier, all humanoids, who publish with humanoids. The thing is that if you say any of those names to French people, I guarantee you they will know who they are. If they're comics fans, but I don't guarantee you that even every French comics fan will know who Claveloux is. So it's interesting that but that's just one of the weird paradoxes that you start getting into with translation, is that you find out that it's just like the cliche about the French loving Paul Auster and Jerry Lewis. They're huge there, but they're not they're not as huge here. And it's going to be like that. It's like if
Jerry Lewis is huge here, maybe not Paul Auster. I mean,
but if this book does well, let's say, or even if it doesn't, she'll still become more of a cult name here than she will have been in France, I think.
Okay, that's interesting.
So it's weird, yeah, and it happens like that.
Well, this month, back on the Eurocomics series, Edward and I discussed 3 books, 2 of which came out back in May, and 1 will be out later this month. We started off with Carlos Sampayo and Jose Muñoz's biography of Billie Holiday. After that, we looked at Jose Luis Bocquet and Catel Muller's Josephine Baker. And then we wrapped up with a very different kind of book that will be coming out late this month, The Green Hand and Other Stories by Nicole Claveloux. So it's good to be back in the saddle again with you, Edward, and I wish you the best of luck in continuing to adjust to fatherhood. A lot going on in your life.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. No, it is good to be back, shooting the comics breeze with you, and I look forward to our the reads for the next month and the year beyond. There's certainly no shortage of them.
That's right. We got a lot to talk about, and so make sure you check back now every month for the Euro Comics episodes. And if you want to find great comics like the ones that Edward and I discuss on this series, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Now, as Edward pointed out at the top of the show, right now, you can't find any of the books that we mentioned on this month's episode, but if you pre-order, let's say future books in translation, you can't find better deals than on Discount Comic Book Service. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Yeah, we talked about a lot of issues today. We'd love to hear from you about them, or about your favorite new reads, or just a welcome back kind of thing. So write us. You can write us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or write me directly at edward@comicsalternative.com.
Yes, or me at derek@comicsalternative.com. We're also all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and now Slack. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And also, remember, don't forget to check out what Edward mentioned at the beginning of the show, and that is the comic that he worked on with Claire Stevens, Going Native. And you can find it, Words Without Borders?
Yep, at Words Without Borders. I also write fiction, short stories, under the name H.V. Chow, my own work, and I have one at the Saturday Evening Post, of all places, recently from the middle of October. It's called Raymond Chandler at the Saturday Evening Post, and I won't spoil it, but if you do get a chance to read it, it's sadly timely. I don't really write political fiction a lot, but this one has remained timely ever since I wrote it. So do give it if you like short stories, do give it a look-see.
Wow, did you forget that earlier, or you just wanted to spring it on us at the very end of the show?
No, I just, things go in and out of my head these days with the sleep deprivation.
Yes. So, yeah, well, I'll let you go to get some sleep if you can, although I can hear Anouk in the background.
Oh, can you really?
Yeah, it's okay, but it adds to the ambience of your experience and what you've been through.
Well, just because I haven't heard, any bone gnawing on your end or toy chewing.
Yes, so. Yeah, my dog Bucky has been nicely napping the entire time.
Does that make you Cap? Are you Cap then if he's Bucky?
Yeah, and in fact, one of our co-host pals, Sean Kleefeld, actually took that classic cover of Captain America #1 and photoshopped my Bucky into the lower right corner where Cap's Bucky was.
Oh, that's awesome. Did you put that up on Facebook or something?
Yeah, it's on Facebook, so definitely check that out.
I'll check it out.
Right. So, yeah, Edward and I are both have household changes with babies and pets. But we hope that you've enjoyed our discussion of these 3 comics. So definitely check these out. Check out Edward's new creations of his own. And until next month, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward.
See you later.
Take care.